So now I think everyone realizes, I don't think this is a shock in this room or across our community, that we have a housing crisis. And the little steps that we've been doing along the way are great, but they're not going to solve the problem for enough people in our community. So I'll just talk a little bit about the work I've done over the past couple of years, specifically at Multnomah County. 2 years ago, in partnership with the City of Portland, the City of Gresham, Multnomah County, Home Forward, the faith community, our business leaders, we started Home for Everyone, which is really a comprehensive plan on how to address homelessness in our community. It's not sexy. There's not a cute little logo with lots of splashy billboards, so I think a lot of people don't understand, but it really addresses all the key pieces. It talks about housing, homelessness prevention. It's a lot cheaper to keep someone in their house than to have them become homeless and then have to find a new apartment for them. So it talks about homelessness prevention. It talks about housing stability, helping people get back into housing once that they've been out. And it talks about shelter safety off the streets, so getting more shelter for people who are experiencing a crisis right now. We know that shelter is not the answer. It's not the end-all be-all. We need more affordable housing in our community. So I think that the lessons that you will learn today and the conversations that you will have will be really helpful for all of us as we learn how do we help people who are experiencing a crisis right now. You can know that there's a plan and that there's been a lot of money put into that plan, but it doesn't help when you're sitting across the room from a mom with 2 kids who can't find a place to sleep that night. And really, that's why I think that we're all here. I know that's what drives me in this work, is thinking about those kids. Is the times I've been to our family shelter and seeing the kids doing their homework outside of the shelter by the light of the street post. That's not okay. It's not who we are as a community. So I want to thank you again for being here today, and I look forward to hearing the results of your morning, of your day. Thank you.
Telling Rose, sometimes it can be really challenging because in human services, we talk a lot about the why we do the work, which is not really that helpful when you have an eviction notice. Your mission statement doesn't really matter to somebody who's needing to figure out in the next 48 hours what they're going to do. And so the work really became how do we give people the practical tools so that they can find the resources they need, and that's really the frame for today. We are all committed to the work. I think that's a fairly safe assumption. And today the challenge is how do we understand better what's available for the people that we collectively serve. And today, as Rose said, was planned partly because Rose's phone was ringing a lot and people were asking the same questions. So we thought, well, let's be efficient and gather people together and have a conversation at the same time. But it was really designed because we know for all of our work that if people have safe, decent, affordable housing, they're going to be thriving in the community. They're going to be able to participate in the community better. Kids will show up at school ready to learn, ready to go home and do their homework and come prepared the next day. The community will be healthier, etc. So we know the value of a home, and we know the challenges that we're facing in the community right now. And I bet all of us know a story of somebody, it might even be yourself or somebody in your own family who is faced with today's current housing challenges. Yesterday this was brought home for me in a very real way. I was at my local coffee shop, and the fellow that owns it, I know from when I used to work at the food bank, so it's a small town. And he's a baker, and his rent just went up 55%. So he's going to have to leave his bakery and coffee shop that he's poured his heart and soul into for the last 5 years, and go get a job. And he really has no idea what he's going to do. And he went on to tell me that across the street at the Bijou, folks might be familiar with the Bijou downtown, they're closed on Tuesdays because they can't hire a line cook. And next door, Stumptown has never had trouble hiring baristas, but they're now having to do recruitment for folks because they can't find people who can afford to live here and work at minimum wages. So it was, that's one block, a block from the Lincoln Building of what's happening in our own community in a very, very real way. And data backs up that anecdotal experience. This is really rather shocking, but rents are rising 14% every year. I suspect that's actually kind of on the lower end. And more than half of tenants spend over a third of their income on rent, which, as we know, leaves very little left for the basic necessities of food or recreational activities for kids or any number of other needs that folks have. And we know, as Rose said, whether you're a DD case manager, whether you're a nurse, whether you're a librarian, you're interfacing with people who are seeking housing assistance wherever you sit. And we know you do your best to offer the best resources that you know about. And we understand that well-being is built, literally built, whether it's strengthened by materials like relationships, community resources, and opportunities to thrive. And when I think about back to sort of time at 201, when you don't know where you're going to sleep tonight, when you don't know if your kid can go to the same school tomorrow, when you don't know what your transit options are, you're not able to thrive. You're not able to go beyond meeting basic needs. And we all know the effect of trauma on people's ability to be successful in their lives. So the importance of that stability comes home all the more.
True. But when we talk about, again, I think people have this image of Oregon as being this place that's very progressive, that, you know, we passed the bottle bill, we gave people a nickel for a bottle, now we're going to give them a dime. And we have progressive land use laws, we have the urban growth boundary, we have hippies and hipsters, and we have our own TV show around Portlandia. But I think that the history we're going to talk about here is less familiar to people. It doesn't get portrayed quite as often. You know, I think we are starting to make the news more now about our population here, and that we have the highest, or one of the highest proportions of white residents in the country. That our demographics is as a very white state, that nationally African Americans make up the population are about 13%. Here in Oregon, that's only 2%. Portland itself is now seen as the whitest major city in the country. As we know here, not only here but in other places, the demographics are changing. In 1990, the population of people of color was 9%. A decade later, it was up to 16.5%. And the latest figures in the census showed it was up to 21%. We also saw, or have seen here in Portland, concentrations of people of the same race and ethnicity who are concentrated in neighborhoods and communities, these segregated housing patterns that we've seen here in Portland. And really have to ask ourselves why that is. I will tell you that I asked myself that prior to coming to this work around housing. I mentioned I was on the Gresham Planning Commission and lived out in Rockwood. And that was back in 2008, not that long ago, where I did not know the dynamics around segregation here in Portland and how these communities developed and why we were seeing so many African American families coming to Rockwood and to East Portland. So I think it is a history that we do not really acknowledge and know much about. And I think, as the other speakers referred to this morning, you know, why do we care about the past when we're dealing with these current issues? And really it is so that we can have this understanding, and I think especially for folks in institutional positions, not only understand, but be able to acknowledge how we got here and what folks are experiencing when they come through the door as you're trying to help them. As we started to come into the 20th century, again, we started to see other immigrants that came here to Portland, like in other areas of the country. But those were a lot of immigrants that came from Northern Europe and spoke many different languages and practiced different religions. A lot of those folks settled in the area very near to where we are now here in Albina. So Albina at that time was its own small town, like the areas around Portland. They were all separate little towns. There was also a small population of African Americans that had come into Oregon at that time and had come to Portland to work in railroads. The Union Pacific Railroad Yard is not far from us, down the river and down next to the river, and across the river is the Union Station. But then segregation here in Portland was not as extreme as it was in the southern U.S. So here, restrooms, drinking fountains, and buses and other public accommodations were not segregated, but there were some, such as theaters, music venues, public parks, roller rinks, bowling alleys, and restaurants and public pools that were segregated. So it wasn't quite as extreme as in the South, but there certainly were instances of that here. Here in Portland, the NAACP was founded in 1914, which is the oldest chapter of the NAACP west of the Mississippi, and it was formed to help end those discrimination in public accommodations. And so they worked not only on public accommodations, but also employment and also on housing. As we move forward now we'll start to look at the housing segregation and how these patterns start to develop in the 1920s. So one of the key dates we talk about in this, here in Portland, you know, segregation was really a trend that started to happen throughout the country. And here in Portland, the key date is this 1919, where the Portland Realty Board, which is the folks who control the Portland Realtors licenses, put into their code of ethics that it was against the rules for members to sell properties in a white neighborhood to Negroes or Orientals. At the time, it was believed that by mixing neighborhoods, it would cause a decrease in property values. So that the realtors, again, were well-intentioned and felt like, well, we ought to help people protect their property values, so we'll kick you out of the realty board if you sell to an African American or an Asian. And again, they defined a white neighborhood as a 4-block radius. So any neighborhood that was all white for 4 blocks was considered a white neighborhood, and you could not sell a home to an African American or an Asian in those areas. So here in Portland, the area that was to be designated for African Americans was right here in Albina. And so so that's one dynamic that contributed to segregation here in Portland. Another is if you ever buy an older home or see an older deed for a home in lots of neighborhoods here in Portland, there were restrictive covenants that also said that you could not sell your home to an African American or an Asian. You could have them there as a domestic servant, but you could not sell your home to them. That was actually part of like your restrictive covenants. And that was in areas here, right areas right in here, including Grant Park, but also down in Cedar Hills, Raleigh Hills, Lake Oswego, and other areas. So this is Dr. DeNorville Unthank, and I want to tell you a little about his story here. So Dr. Unthank, for whom Unthank Park is named, was a prominent African-American doctor here in Portland. He was one of 3 black doctors here in the 30s. At that time, African-Americans weren't allowed to practice in hospitals. So he had to see patients in his home. It's unclear, they could sometimes go to hospitals in emergencies. But in 1933, Dr. Unthank tried to move his family into Southeast Portland, over in the Westmoreland area. Before he arrived there, the neighbor who had presented Dr. Unthank with a petition that was signed by 75 of his neighbors and offered him more than $1,500 if they would not move in. So similar to the story if you've ever seen Raisin in the Sun, again, that was a lot of money at that time. Dr. Unthank and his family moved in anyway, and they were terrorized. His house was vandalized, the windows were broken, there was a dead cat that was thrown on the lawn, and this harassment continued again and again until Dr. Unthank and his family eventually moved. They had to move 3 times before he and his family could find a place to live peacefully here in Portland, and this was in 1933. So again, that was that kind of third dynamic around enforcing segregation in our communities. This was kind of an informal way where communities would harass people out of their neighborhoods. So that combined with those restrictive covenants which said you could not sell your home to an African American, the code of ethics of the realtors was another way that enforced segregation. So those are some of the policies that we start to see that set these housing patterns of segregation in place here in Portland. The Depression also forced, at that time, black-owned businesses that were located in downtown Portland. So that was one of the original areas that was the central area for African Americans down along Northwest Broadway. During the Depression, there were many black-owned businesses that didn't make it down there or were being pressured by the city to move out of that area. One of those, if you're ever down in the area, if you don't know about it, is the Golden West Hotel down there on Broadway, which was the largest black-owned business west of the Mississippi. And so if you have the opportunity, I encourage you to go down and see the display they have there. So African Americans had settled in that area because it was very close to the Union Station at the time. Most African Americans who were here in this time period, again, when we're talking about the very early part of the 20th century in the 1920s, worked in the railroad yards. There was a great exhibit at the Oregon Historical Society about the African American community and their work in the railroad yards during that time period. So the other formal mechanics of segregation that we really identify with is the practice of redlining. And part of that practice was the use of real estate appraisal manuals created by the American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers during the 20s. So this is, when you get your house appraised, there are all kinds of policies and documents they use to figure out what the value is. In the 1930s and 40s, one of those documents was this list that talked about the value of real estate based on the races of folks who owned homes or lived in those areas. So this was used by banks and insurance companies to underwrite loans, which led to that practice that we know as redlining, which literally were maps with red lines on them that said, this is not an area where we want to make loans or will insure homes. Red was for no, yellow was for maybe, green was for yes. So on this here, you'll see most favorable is English, German, Scottish, Irish, and Scandinavians. It goes through a few other Caucasian races. Down here at the very bottom, number 9, Negroes, and number 10, Mexicans. So this was used extensively in the 30s and 40s to make loans. One of the resulting impacts of that was probably everybody in this room, that's maybe a huge assumption, thinks of home loans today as 30-year products for which we put down 10%, maybe 20% on a home, and that's what home loans look like. Prior to the creation of the Federal Home Administration in 1934, if you wanted to buy a home, it meant you had to put down 50% to buy a home, and you had to pay off your mortgage in 5 or so years. So think about whether or not you could have bought a home under those conditions. This is a time when there was a massive influx of folks who came here to work in the wartime shipyards of Henry J. Kaiser. So at that time, in 1942, more than 100,000 people came here to Portland, including 15,000 to 25,000 African Americans, which was 10 times more than the African American population that was here at that time. So again, this is 1942. Here's another headline from that 1942 period, an Oregonian headline that read, quote, "New Negro migrants worry city." African Americans that came here and worked in the shipyards had the lowest level jobs, and they weren't allowed to be part of the unions that were formed at that time. There was also a massive development of housing at that time. So we start to move into another piece of the housing story that happened here in Portland, the need to house all these folks that came here. Well, the public housing that was developed at that time was segregated housing, a decision that was made by the Housing Authority of Portland. So of all the housing they developed here in Portland, there were only 2 of the public housing projects in which African Americans could live. That was at Vanport, so I know folks are pretty familiar probably with the Vanport story, and also Giles Lake, which also no longer exists. It was down where Montgomery Park is in northwest Portland. When the war ended, you can imagine that there were some challenges for some of the communities that were here. The Japanese that were coming back to the areas from which they had been taken, some of them came home and were not warmly greeted. George Nakata, who also speaks on our tour, talks about his family being given $25 and put on the train back to Portland. So when folks came back after being incarcerated, some neighbors welcomed them back, but there was also a great deal of hostility in the communities from which they came. Those that had left had lost a great deal of their property in areas like Hood River. Japanese Americans lost title to 75% of the land they owned and had been farming prior to leaving. Nationally, the Federal Reserve Bank estimated that ethnic Japanese lost more than $400 million worth of property along the West Coast. And when they came back, they were denied mortgage loans to buy property. So you also start to see signs here about that no Japs allowed and this anti-Japanese sentiment after World War II. For African Americans, again, the jobs that they came and had in the shipyards did not allow them to be in unions, so their jobs were not protected. In 1945, the unemployment rate for whites after World War II was 8%. For African Americans, it was 50%. And so here in Portland, again, city leaders were already worried about the influx of African Americans, and so there was pressure for that community to leave. The Red Cross offered one-way bus tickets for African Americans to leave our community. And about half of those African Americans did leave. After World War II, there were about 11,000 African Americans left here in Portland. Those that stayed, again, had this issue around where they could live. You remember the public housing that was created for war housing only allowed African Americans in 2 places, in Vanport and Giles Lake, and then, or the Albina area was the other place folks could live. In Vanport, the African American population went from 12% to more than 25% after the war. And then if you know the history of Vanport and the flood that occurred there in May of 1948, that further displaced the community of African Americans there and pushed them into other areas of Portland. So as we move into after the war into the 1950s, now we really move into this area of urban renewal and involuntary displacement that occurred, especially here in the Albina area. So again, this was one of the areas that African Americans could live, was this Albina area. And let's talk about the dynamics then that happened here that we're more familiar with, that started to occur in the mid-1900s. So this was an era across the country of urban renewal, which is sometimes derisively referred to as Negro removal. This was a trend that began in the 50s that involved demolition of deteriorating mixed-use districts to make way for these big public projects, big public buildings or freeways. The concept for urban renewal at that time was the way to end blight in these neighborhoods was to either surround them with development and not allow it to spread, or to go in and raise a community and essentially cut out that cancer. So that was the concept for the way we thought about urban renewal during this time, and we know what the results were. Here in Portland, the first urban renewal project that decimated this community was in 1956 when the voters approved a bond measure to build the Memorial Coliseum just down the street here. So where the Memorial Coliseum is, it's a little hard to picture. All of that was housing. This whole area, and I think somebody else earlier referred to how different this area is from when they lived here. This all used to be single family housing. From here to the river, down to the Coliseum, all the way up through North and Northeast Portland, all the way up Williams Avenue, used to look like that very northern portion of Williams Avenue when you get past the high rises and all those other pieces. This is a picture of the Hill Block building, which was at Williams and Russell and was really the center of the community here. The cupola that is in Dawson Park now, this right here, came from that building right there. This building was located at Williams and Russell, and here's what that looks like today. So the intersection near the Urban League is where that building was located. The original intent of the Federal Fair Housing Act is to end the segregation that was created by the federal government through practices like redlining. As the executive director of the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, it would be difficult for me to say that has come to pass, because then I would be out of a job. But I'm happy to get there if we can get that work done. But that's the intent of things like the Federal Fair Housing Act, its amendments in 1988 to include families and those with disabilities. So again, there's that history, this relevant history about why we do things the way we do them today. We're living with these ghosts of our past that around discrimination, segregation, and displacement. It helps us understand, if we go all the way back to the Constitution and how we got here as a state, why there are so few African Americans here. When we talk about redlining and involuntary displacement, it helps us answer the question about why do people live where they do? And the answer to that isn't always, it's because that's where they choose to. I think those of us that are housed and believe that we've had housing choice in our life don't understand that hasn't been true for many communities right here in Portland. Whether or not it's through economic forces like involuntary displacement or through redlining, there are lots of reasons that folks in our community have not had housing choice. We also need to know this history because, like I said, there's this underlying tension, this almost trauma-informed perspective that we need to have when we approach projects. If you're familiar with the bike lanes that came right over here on North Williams, there was a lot of talk about the tensions that came forward at that time. People saying, well, wait a minute, I guess I'll say this, people who had gentrified that area coming and saying, well, wait a minute, this is just about bike lanes. We don't need all this other stuff. Well, if we don't address all that stuff, if we don't address the history that got us to bike lanes and high rises in North Williams, we're going to see those tensions. We saw those same tensions arise over here on MLK with the Majestic Realty development that came that wanted to bring a Trader Joe's. I don't like to, a lot of people call that tension Trader Joe's. I don't like to call it that. I think that neighborhood would have liked a Trader Joe's. It was about Majestic Realty, a California developer that was going to come and benefit from that community by bringing their development there and not allowing the community that was there to benefit from it. To let them make decisions about what's coming there and how housing could come there. Because there's a grocery store that's going on that site still. So this wasn't Trader Joe's. This was about how we involve people in the process. The other piece, if you don't know about statistics, is, we wonder, why is there such a wealth gap between African Americans and whites and Latinos and whites? It goes back to that history of redlining, this housing discrimination that didn't allow folks, African Americans, to buy homes in areas of opportunity. There's a wealth gap between whites and blacks of about 10 to 1, somewhere between 8 to 1 to 10 to 1. Whites have 10 times the wealth that blacks do. Much of it rooted in our opportunity to participate in intergenerational wealth through buying homes and passing those on to our other generations.
It's where they choose to take their own life. And poof, the life is gone. 5 people last year committed suicide who were homeless. 5 more were killed. More than 47 people died accidental deaths on our streets. And more than 30 people died of natural causes on the streets of Multnomah County last year. One gentleman, Christopher, died of a perforated ulcer, and he laid in a storage unit for 2 days, isolated, alone, after being discharged from the hospital, and died a horrible, agonizing death. 88 people died on the streets of Multnomah County last year, and we have no reason to believe that that number will decline this year. Homelessness is a traumatic experience. The experience of homelessness is traumatic, as many of you know. Surviving on the streets, you become a shell of yourself. Maybe you've arrived to the streets after a nervous breakdown 1, 2, or 3. You're forced to live in safety, sleep deprivation. Your world is turned upside down. You have anxiety, panic attacks. It doesn't take much to just knock you over. And as we as a community respond to this homelessness, we see more and more people on the streets. But to understand where we are today, we have to go back in history that points us to the crisis that we have in our community and around the country. In 1929, the stock market crashed. By 1933, there were more than 1 million people sleeping on the streets of America. That's about the same number of people sleeping on the streets today. The federal government responded. They responded with intentional programs to be able to support the safety nets of our communities, with the idea that you couldn't have a healthy society without being able to provide people with safety net programs. Things like Social Security was created. The GI Bill of Rights, which says that every veteran returning home deserves a safe place to call home and an education. Many of the mental health programs were created. And the federal government began to invest in public housing with the idea that you cannot have a healthy community without thinking about housing in a way that we think about public infrastructure. Housing is no different than our roads, they're no different than our parks, they're no different than fire or police, and we have to be able to think about housing as a public infrastructure, and when we don't, part of the stool is kicked out from under us. In 1980, the federal government began to disinvest in housing. And that is the sole reason that we find ourselves in the place we are today. In 1979, the federal government was investing $84 billion in housing authorities around the United States. $84 billion. By 1984, 4 years later, the federal government was investing $20 billion. That's a loss of about $64 billion a year annually that was never returned. And overnight, the modern day homelessness crisis was created. That crisis, the response to that crisis began to be the continuum that we still see today. The emergence of a mass shelter network, the emergence of plans to end homelessness. In the 1980s, Bill Clinton had a plan to end homelessness. George Bush had a plan to end chronic homelessness. Barack Obama had a plan to end veterans homelessness. But not one president has stood up and said, we need a plan to end homelessness. And what we've created is a reactionary response to a problem that we cannot scale up to. Local communities began to have to carry the water for what was once a federal investment. Some communities got ahead of the curve, other communities did not. So throughout the 80s and 90s, throughout the 2000s, we were basically managing the problem. As many of you know, basically the line that people go through: the streets, shelter, rent assistance, temporary housing, hopefully permanent housing. Then the recession came around 2005, 2007, and basically socked us in the gut. All the people that were on the streets were basically, that we were managing, there became a new emergence of people on our streets, working families in Oregon, many people from rural communities with horrific economies began to migrate to urban environments. Our suburban communities do not invest in housing, so people began to come to Multnomah County from the state of Oregon. As soon as the recession ended, it did not end for poor people, but it created a dynamic of a boom in Portland that's created the rent increases, continued gentrification, that's basically left us in a situation that we're walking in quicksand. And everybody understands that. Now we can put on a show and say that we're going to cut homelessness in half, but anybody that's anybody understands that we're in real trouble. There's a humanitarian crisis on our streets. Because the simple way that we had been addressing the problem or managing the problem was not by investing in public housing stock or affordable housing stock, but it was addressing the problem by more shelters, more rent assistance, more ways to be able to move people onto the private market. What's happening today is that people are not able to obtain housing through rental assistance. So a homeless emergency was created by mayors up and down the West Coast because they clearly looked around and realized that they had no path out. There was no way out. Well, what are we going to do? So the very system that we have created to respond to homelessness in the 80s, the 90s, throughout the 2000s, and today is now being tested. And we have to be able to evolve to be able to get to a place where we are going to address the problem. Right now, groups like Join, anybody that works with anybody in the private rental market understands very clearly that the money that they had yesterday is not stretching far enough today. How do you get people in first and last month's rent, low vacancy rates, lack of affordable housing stock while you have people building up on the streets? That's why you're seeing a conversation about shelters again. We're not having a conversation about housing, we're having a conversation about shelters, and that is systematically wrong, false, and will lead us to a continued increase of homelessness over time. It's a house of cards. Because if we build all the shelters in the world, what will happen is we will fill those shelters. But if we are not moving people into housing, 3 to 5 years from now, we will find ourselves with a double, an increase in shelter beds that are full with the same amount of people on the streets. So what do? People say Charlie Hales is crazy for doing what he did, for basically creating legal tent camping. But I think he understood at a very deep level that there were two things that needed to happen. One, the public discourse around housing had to change in our community. Two, he had to shove the issue down people's throats to do it. And in order to do that, he basically created the idea of legalizing tent camping and making it visible overnight. A lot of politicians weren't down with that. A lot of politicians continue to still not be down with that. And so you're seeing the shift begin to happen. But what it's done in our community is created a dynamic where everybody is now talking about the issue of housing. Now, there's many reasons why housing has become a top-tiered issue. I'm involved with groups that do a lot of research. We look at things. Housing's always been about 9 or 10 in our community. You've got education, you've got public safety, you've got a variety of issues that arrive of what the public cares about more than housing. In the last 2 years, housing has shot to number 1. We are outpolling education, we are outpolling public safety, and people are freaking out. And the housing crisis has began to permeate itself, not just with poor people, but with people throughout our community that very clearly understand that the dynamics of our city are changing at such a rapid rate that the comfortable nest egg that they once had also may be threatened. And so Street Roots has major donors that are just as freaked out as the people on the streets, because all of a sudden they look out at a world where they're fifth generation Portlanders and their parents are aging and their kids, they're going to be social workers. And no social worker will be able to afford a place to live in Portland in the next decade. So what happens all of a sudden when the outreach workers that are helping the people that are displaced are becoming displaced themselves? And so we've created a situation that is very devastating in many ways, but it gives us a chance to unify. Now, politicians will give you a million reasons why they're doing what they're doing. Ultimately, why they're doing it is because their jobs are at stake and housing is polling high. Maybe there's a few that care about the issue, but poverty, like many issues, is a calculated endeavor. And the reality is, politicians who have been asleep at the wheel for the last 2 decades in Oregon, where we should have had inclusionary zoning, we should have real estate transfer tax, we should have all these mechanisms in place to be able to treat housing as a rainy day fund, but instead for the last 20 years, it wasn't an issue that rose to the top. It was messy, political, it was risky politically. You're going to piss the very people off that write you checks to get into office. But now the game has changed. And the very politicians who were saying, well, I don't know if we can do anything about that 5 years ago, are saying they're the biggest housing champions in the world. We're all right with that. And we're fine with that. And in the last year, we've had a banner year. We've created in the city of Portland and throughout the state a construction excise tax, so any development that happens, money will go to a housing trust fund. We've taxed short-term rentals. In the Airbnb market, money going to a housing trust fund. We've been able to lift the urban renewal areas, percentages in which we're investing in affordable housing. We're bringing a bond to the ballot in November for $258 million. And if any one of you vote no, you should be shamed. And we are trying to figure out different mechanisms to be able to motivate our regional governments to start to contribute to the problem. Because right now, when you look at scale, Multnomah County, the city of Portland are investing an enormous amount of money in the problem. But people don't care about insider politics, they don't care about anything other than they continue to see people sleeping on the streets in public parks. So we can tell a narrative till we're blue in the face that we ended veterans' homelessness. But I'll tell you, nobody else besides the people in this room are listening, because they don't see it. And so we have to change the narrative. We have to be able to capture housing in a way where we move the issue outside of delivery and outside of direct service into a place of action, into a place of building a social justice movement, into a place where we build a foundation for the next 50, 100 years in Oregon where housing remains a top-tiered issue. So what can you do? Well, there's small things, there's big things. Small things are being able to educate yourself and get involved in the many coalitions that are emerging in our community around the issue of housing. There are many. The Welcome Home Coalition, Living Cully is doing amazing work, Opal's doing amazing work. Lots of groups and coalitions are beginning to work on this problem and being able to do it very intentionally. We're becoming more sophisticated, we're getting more funding equals more staff. I tell foundations, we don't need more money for rent assistance, we need money for 10 organizers who can become sophisticated and go drive a housing policy in the state of Oregon. Because the ultimate reality is we cannot scale up to solve this problem. We have to be able to move the dial politically. So that means being able to get involved, taking time at your workplaces to take a day off and go volunteer for a coalition, to go knock on doors, to go to the leadership academies that exist throughout our community that are doing trainings on how to talk about the issue. And we are becoming at a place where we're able to drive conversations both in the liberal sector and with the crazy uncle who is just not gonna be there with us. But if we talk about the issue right and we motivate our peer networks, our friends, our family, we are going to be able to drive the issue in a way that we never have before. There is that opportunity today. In many ways, the housing movement has been unsophisticated, scattered, living in a place of scarcity. We've been reactionary. We've never gotten ahead of the curve to be able to build a movement the same way that others in our community have been able to do. That time is changing, and you have the ability to engage in that movement. We have to be able to make people uncomfortable. We have to be able to stand up to the industries that historically fund us. I know it's hard to stand up to a bank for a nonprofit when they're giving you a chump change. They're making you stand for a photo op for $5,000 because they're giving you socks when they created the housing crisis. And so we have to be able to be brave. Executive directors have to be able to be brave. You have to put on a different hat. Executive directors that I find going to government functions that are only concerned about their organizations are not true leaders. They have to be concerned about the people and the collective system. And that's you deal with that every day as government employees. You see it. And there are executive directors that will give themselves to the movement. If that means Street Root's not getting $100,000 or $200,000, but it means Join getting $200,000 or Northwest Pilot Project, that's the way we have to be thinking. But if people are trying to work you for only their programs without thinking about it in the larger context, well, maybe they should move aside. In many ways, we've lost our city, and I hear what the gentleman said about, I hate to hear that, but we have to be able to rise above that kind of rhetoric and be able to capture what we have to be able to build in deep affordability in our community. And so we have to mitigate the problem, we have to manage the problem, and until we have a housing movement across our country, we will not solve the problem, but we will continue to work hard, smart, and if we work together, we can do some really great things in the next decade. So thank you very much.